Hello again. In Conservation With, the series of Zoom interviews with the makers and shakers, the movers and groovers within the world of conservation. I'm David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder, and today my guest is a friend of mine I've actually had on before, Joe Shute. He's been on before talking about the weather because that was his previous book, I believe, but he will tell us all about it. Um, we're here to talk about rats and also his book, Stowaway, The Disreputable Exploits of the Rat. Joe, how are you and where are you?
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on again. I'm very well, thank you. I'm currently in Sheffield, so nowhere near being able to see the eclipse. But talking about my previous book on the weather, for many years I've written a weekly weather column for the Daily Telegraph and write a lot about the weather and nature for them and other national newspapers. And back in 2016, they actually sent me to the Faroe Islands when a total eclipse was happening there. And they sent me in a photographer. I was reminded of it this week, just looking at the coverage from the US. And they sent me in a photographer over there at great expense because they have these things called eclipse chasers, and they'll follow eclipses all over the world. So to get to the Faroe Islands was really kind of difficult, and the paper spent a lot of money on our airfares and hotel bills. And we got there days in advance, and the photographer worked out exactly the perfect spot to see the eclipse. And then when it was meant to come, it was cloudy and we
Oh,
didn't see a single thing. And the editors were not best pleased, especially because a photograph came in from Cornwall that was much better than anything we'd produced. So even if you're blanking out that day in the diary for a few years' time, don't get your hopes up too much, David.
yeah, well, I bear that in mind, absolutely. Just to fill you in for those who don't know who Joe is, he's an author, a national newspaper journalist, as you mentioned before. He's a nature columnist and regular contributor to the Daily Telegraph and writes for other national newspapers and publications, including the Independent and I newspaper. And as he previously mentioned, his books include Forecast, The Diary of the Lost Seasons. We're talking about his newest one today, The Stowaway, or Stowaway even, not The Stowaway. Uh, and what else have you done? There you go. You have to put it in front of your chest. There you go. Yeah, cover the book there. Beautiful. And the A Shadow Above, the fall and rise of the Raven. And you are also currently a postgraduate researcher funded by Manchester Metropolitan University's Leverhulme unit for the design of cities of the future and the Centre for Place Writing. Now that all sounds very interesting. Can you kind of just quickly break down this whole thing about the design for cities of the future? Because I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, and actually it ties into the Rats book quite neatly as well, David. It's a series of funded PhDs at Manchester Met University, and there's 15 of us in total, and we're all kind of creative practitioners, is the academic term for it, but basically kind of researchers, often with a sort of arts-based focus as well. And the idea of the funding is each one of us is looking at ways of creating a more sort of equitable city, but also particularly around the environment and sustainability as well. So the PhD I'm doing, and one which has led to a lot of rat sightings, is focusing on a river in Manchester called the River which I don't know if you or anyone here has heard of that. Certainly, even people who live in Manchester alongside the river have never heard of it. But it's kind of lost now in the sense that it flows underneath the city centre, where it's open. It's sort of surrounded by scrapyards and rubbish dumps, and it's a place where people don't go. But it's got this fantastic history as the river that Manchester was built on. Really, it was the centre of the Industrial Revolution. And the project I'm doing is using creative writing and using place writing, which is the sort of writing I've done in all three of my books, to connect people to the river. So I've been doing lots of sort of writing workshops with a whole host of community groups, from sort of primary school kids right the way up to pensioners, taking people out to the river, exploring the history of it, and creating this real sort of, or attempting to create at least this real kind of community connection to the river as well. And also discovering the wildlife of it. You know, it's like many rivers in the UK, it is suffering from a whole range of problems. Sewage pollution is massive there. But equally, you know, from a river that was declared biologically dead a few decades ago, there is nature returning there as well. I've seen kingfishers, dipper, egrets, heron, all on this river. And you'll know something like a dipper is a bird associated with kind of clear, fast flowing upland streams. And here you have it a mile from central Manchester. Um, and kind of invertebrate life like damselflies. But equally, you see this kind of this things like massive forests of Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam and endless rat burrows as well. And it's a real sort of interesting thread running through the city as well.
Well, listen, when you get your PhD, you need to come back and talk to us about this because this is absolutely fascinating. And I think, you know, something that people need to learn about without a doubt. And I'm really fascinated by this whole idea of cities for the future because you really do need to be considering all that and implementing that now as opposed to thinking about it as a theory. You know, we need to be out there doing that.
It'd be a
Um,
pleasure. Yeah, I'd love to.
yeah, you're back. Anyway, let's talk about your book, Stowaway, The Disreputable Exploits of the Rat. The first question that comes to my mind is why? Why are you writing a book about rats? Why?
My publisher asked me the same question, David, when I suggested it to them. Um, I I've been thinking about this because the book's coming out on Friday, and I've been doing a fair bit of sort of publicity about it. And it's a question I've been asked elsewhere as well. And I think it started for me with quite a negative reaction to rats, really. Like you, and like I'm sure everyone watching, you know, I'm a real nature lover, and but I've got this kind of one species. For me, rats were always the species that would do that sort of visceral sense of kind of loathing and disgust, really, almost panic if I would see a rat. And it's interesting, actually, in researching the book, I found David Attenborough. There's a few interviews with him where he says rats are the one animal that he really can't stand, and every time. Even if a rat would come into a room when he's there, he'd have to jump onto the table. And this is a guy, you know, who will interact with kind of every living creature. And so I kind of grew up with this fear, really. I grew up in London and with rats kind of plentiful around and had this kind of fear, really. And then when I moved to my house in Sheffield 7 years ago, we had rats. We discovered soon after moving in, living in the basement, and they would climb up from the cellar into the kitchen. And we heard all these kind of rustles and bumps in the kitchen cupboards, and investigated a bit further one day and found a hollowed out butternut squash and a bag of brown rice that had just been sort of totally demolished. And I did what people do when you have rats in your house. I put out traps and eventually managed to kill the two rats that were there, and they disappeared. And that was kind of that. And then soon after, we started keeping chickens in our back garden. And we've been doing that ever since. And doing that, as anyone who's ever kept chickens will tell you, you know, if you have chickens, you'll get rats, no matter what precautions you take or anything like that. And at first, whenever I would see rats appear in our kind of back garden chicken coop, I would panic as if they were in the house again. And, you know, say to my wife, we've got to get rid of these things. They're going to sort of take over. They're going to kind of, you know, do all the things that we sort of believe rats do, you know, kind of have sort of masses and masses of babies that will sort of completely destroy the ecology of the garden. And actually, over time, watching them and getting to know them, I've realized that that's not the case at all. And kind of have spent time and set up sort of wildlife cameras and stuff to watch them kind of in my garden and just how they interact. And that really started to change the way I saw them and the way I thought about them as living creatures. And yeah, that was really the genesis of this book. And it's a book that's taken me sort of all over the world and kind of discovering this other side to the rat that people, including myself, you know, don't really have much of an idea about. That's different to that sense of loathing that we sort of grow up with.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've never been afraid of rats. If anything, if I was going to make a David Attenborough like quote, I'd be saying cockroaches and mosquitoes are the ones I hate.
Ah, really? Yeah.
If I was on, God forbid, if I ever do go on I Am Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, then it's obviously an AI version of me and I should be shot straight afterwards. But if I ever was on that and I had the opportunity to choose between being sort of covered in rats or covered in cockroaches, it's rats all the way. But let's wind back a bit. I mean, you wrote this. Did you write it during lockdown? Didn't you?
I started writing it in lockdown, and there's two sides to the book. One is the sort of a cultural, natural, and social history of rats and people. So a bit like I did with my Raven book, and similar to ravens, actually. I love these creatures that humans kind of put a lot of our own baggage onto. Typically, it's like scavengers. So ravens obviously are scavenging bird species. And when you look at the kind of myths and mythology around them, so much of it, of this idea of ravens being kind of evil or birds that will somehow bring sort of doom upon human kind of settlement. And so much of that we apply to rats as well. And during lockdown, we were kind of, as many people were, sort of kicking our heels at home and thinking of things to do. And I'd started having this idea for the book at this point, and was talking to my wife about it. And she is a great rat lover. She always wanted rats when she was a kid, and was never allowed them. Her dad, just said, "I'm absolutely not having rats in that house, no way." So she'd always wanted them, never been able to. So we thought, why don't we get? It was a time. Remember, lockdown puppies was like a massive thing, and everyone was getting a lockdown puppy. So we thought, why don't we get lockdown rat pups instead? And had a look on a list of local breeders and found one just down the road from us. And yeah, went and got two young fancy rats from there called Molly and Ermintrude. And it was interesting because when we picked them up, I still had that real fear around them. And even though they were such sweet little pups, they're only a couple of inches long. And in the breeders, she kept them in a garage in this box, and I was struggling to kind of pick them up even. And even as we were driving back, I was kind of slightly terrified of these what these things would do when they got to our house. And yeah, so it was a lockdown project, and it started investigating that history, but also getting to know the rats that were living with us as well. They started in tandem, really.
Okay, well let's actually get to know the rat. What is a rat? What is a rat versus a mouse? Because I've been out with people, oh my God, there's a rat, and it turns out it's a mouse. But some people don't actually realize the difference. What is the difference and what is a rat?
Well, I mean, it's a big question, really, because there's a lot of different species, and the two main rats that we know are the brown rat, which is Rattus norvegicus, the Norwegian rat,
Yeah, a very famous Stranglers album.
and
The first ever album they produced, I think, was called Rattus Nevegicus.
is that right?
And one
Yeah,
of the tracks on it was Down in the Sewer. So that
yeah.
tells you what they
I'm gonna
thought.
have to listen out for that, David. I'm just making a note of that. There you go. The rat is in every bit of our culture, and
Exactly.
the boomtown rats as well. Anyway, the second type of rat is the black rat, Rattus rattus, which is kind of known or notorious for being a sort of the plague rat of medieval England. They are, compared to a mouse, they're much bigger, really, is the basic size. But even within themselves, a brown rat is considerably bigger than a black rat as well. They originate from the Far East, so brown rats from the Indian subcontinent and black rats from northeast China. And they have followed humans across the world. So they have basically moved from east to west along human trade routes, and now exist in every continent in the world apart from Antarctica. Um, they are they're just perfectly adapted to survive in all kinds of different environments. They're much more generalists than mice. and they're much more voracious as well. You know, they have more powerful bites. They're stronger. They are able to burrow extremely successfully underneath buildings. The strength of their bites, their teeth are stronger than steel. They can chew through concrete, and that is actually something I've experienced in a potting shed in our garden, which is one of these chicken rats. When it had come a bit too close, it was an elderly male, and it had been sort of expelled from the colony. And I'd seen it a few days previously, kind of walking around the garden during the day. And if you see a rat during the day, you tend is, you know, it's probably a bit desperate and is not living the way it would want to live.
Like this one.
Sorry, yeah, go on,
Like this
David.
rat, like this rat here on my shoulder. He must be desperate.
Oh yeah, I can see that now. I can see the tail. I didn't notice that before.
You thought I had a
Master
pile of
in
rocks behind
disguise
me?
as well. I thought it was a rock.
No, there's not a rockery. There's actually a rattery there.
Oh yeah, I see that now. Okay, yeah. And yeah, so a big one like that. And in our potting shed, there's a the floor is like really poorly laid tarmac, so really kind of cheaply, whenever it was done, just like a few sort of centimeters thick. And this rat had managed to. I came out one morning to get the food because we always keep the chicken food in there, so it's separate from where they're staying. Came out one morning and there was this just massive mound. It looked like a molehill, but a mound of kind of chewed up tarmac, rubble, and whatever was under the ground. And this rat tunneled through that to get in, and just incredible. And yeah, I mean, I think that's them, the sort of basic rat
Yeah,
info in a
we were
nutshell.
talking prior to pressing the record button, and I was giving you some trivial rubbish about the possibility who would win a fight between a gorilla and a brown or grizzly bear. You know, an impossible thing ever to happen.
This is what we talk about in our spare time, David.
Yeah, but you know, someone actually wasted the time to actually produce a video on YouTube, and I wasted my time watching it. But what was interesting was the power of the bite of these animals. I mean, the a gorilla apparently has a much harder bite than a, well, not much harder, but certainly a harder bite than the grizzly bear, who you'd think would be the king of biters. But you told me something quite interesting about the rat's bite.
Yeah, a rat bite is pound for pound equivalent to a grizzly bear and a hippopotamus as well, and 20 times more powerful than the human bite. But it's the ability. There was an interesting research study into this recently, actually, into not just the rat's biting power, but also its chewing power as well. So the bite is obviously its front incisors, but then it has these teeth at the back of its mouth that sort of grind up. And the fact it can do both of those together has been key to the evolutionary success of the rat. It can basically chew through any obstacle.
So it's a bit of it's this opposable thumbs, I suppose. This version.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, I like that comparison. Yeah.
You can use it. Don't worry about it. It's free. But the thing is, what I was thinking about was, I mean, before we start talking about brown and black rats, do you actually know how many rats there are in the world? Because I know I remember actually in my book collection, I got a book on mammals, and there is a big section on rats. There's lots of rats, like cane rats and this rat and that rat. Do you know how many rats there are?
How many different species of
Yeah.
rats? From the top of my head, it's over 70. But I'm wondering if that's rodents now. Um,
There's probably more
it's in
rodents
the
than,
book. I
yeah.
can't remember it off the top of my head, but
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Well, that's the
Um,
thing. If you are watching this and you want to know how many species of rats there are, get yourself to the bookshop and buy this man's book, and it will have all the facts there for you. We're just giving you little tasters so you can kind of think, oh my God, I need to go and research that. So okay, let's get back to the rats. I mean, is the black and the brown rats the main rats that you find in people's homes and stuff around the world? Are they the main ones?
Yeah, they're the main ones. And it's interesting for black rats, certainly in the UK, they have become almost an endangered species. They were once far more far more populous than brown. That's trying to multitask right there. That's what happens, David. They were, yeah, they were far more populous than brown rats. They arrived earlier. They followed the Romans into Britain, and there's evidence of them going back, kind of thousands of years. The brown rats were quite a recent invader. They were sort of 16th, 17th centuries. There's still a bit of dispute over that. Some archaeologists say that they came there earlier. But there's this thing of rats being transgressors. Even to pinpoint exactly when they came is difficult because they're found in so many archaeological digs. But that's just, they find rat skeletons, but they don't know exactly, when they got there. Some rats kind of burrowed down, and it had been sort of a few centuries earlier or than that. But yeah, so in the UK, the brown rat it's a bit of the story of the grey squirrel and the red squirrel. The brown rat has basically outcompeted the black rat. Pushed it to the very margins of the country. So you still find black rats on some islands. There's one island where there's a chapter in the book, which I write, called Inchcombe Island, which is in the Firth of Forth, and is an important seabird breeding island, which is, we'll talk about that, but that's a kind of interesting conflict with rats.
Yeah.
And it's one of the last strongholds of the black rat in Britain, and the whole island is uninhabited, and it's looked after by Natural Environment Scotland. And it took me months and months and months and months, but I eventually persuaded them to let me take a boat out to the island and camp there for a couple of nights and record some footage of the black rats that were out there. And it was incredible seeing them. And when you see them, there's so much, a bit like, when you see a red squirrel compared to when you're so used to seeing greys, they just look so much more kind of delicate and in their movement, so sort of different. And it's very similar with the black rat. They're much more adept at climbing, while brown rats are much more adept at burrowing. But then when you go elsewhere in the world, I'm not sure about what it's like in Extremadura where you are, David, but certainly in the southern Mediterranean, Rattus rattus, the black rat, is much more common. In parts of Africa, I went to Tanzania in the book to write about this incredible project utilizing rats as mine detectors, which maybe we'll talk a bit more about later on. But again, Rattus rattus is much more common there, and the brown rat not so much. But they're the two main dominant rats, really, that have conquered the world between them.
And the black rats you went to visit in Scotland, are they treated as vermin, or are they kind of protected? What's the deal with them?
It's a really interesting one because they are, and there is a case, and it's a case that's made by me in the book, but also a case that's being made in a growing number of cities around the world, that after sort of centuries of attempting to annihilate them, we actually, in urban areas, need to learn to live with rats because everything we throw at them doesn't work, and its wider impact on ecosystems is disastrous. I'm talking in particular about rodenticides and second generation anticoagulants, which have been devised to get over this neophobia that rats have. So if they eat something and they see another rat has eaten it and died, no rats will go near it. The way these anticoagulants work is the rats eat them and the poison is sort of slow activated. So by the time they've moved away from the food source, it will basically liquidize their insides and they kind of bleed out. But rats are a vital tool, a vital source in the food chain for a whole host of species, and things like barn owls, tawny owls, even herons. If you look on YouTube for herons eating live rats, then you can find all sorts of hideous videos, which are sort of amazing to see as well. So these poisons are going all the way through the food chain, and rats, which are evolving so quickly, are developing real resistance to them as well. So they're becoming less and less effective, but having more and more of an impact on ecosystems. So in urban areas, in cities like Paris, where I visited for the book, the local authorities there are saying, actually it's time to abandon this war on the rat and actually think of ways of coexistence. In Amsterdam, there was a news article a few weeks ago on a group of scientists who are proposing they should have rat feeding stations in parks, which they envisage a bit like the Kani Mata temple in India, where rats go and kind of feed on the offerings that are laid out for them. And the idea of that is so people can see rats in their natural environment and kind of get over that sort of irrational fear. But going back to your question, in other settings, and particularly on islands, rats can be absolutely disastrous. They've ended up, and the name of the book, Stowaway, is a kind of a comment on the fact that rats have stowed away on human vessels and still do to this day as they sort of traverse the world. And whenever there's these vessels have had shipwrecks in the past or have docked on islands for whatever reason, rats have kind of streamed off the boats and populated islands. And you'll find them all over the world and really sort of remote, uninhabited islands. But when they're there, they can just absolutely demolish seabird populations and can be totally disastrous. What they're beginning to do now is to have rat eradication programs of islands around the world. There's one on Lundy in the Bristol Channel in the UK, which recently it started about 20 years ago. The most recent figures from their seabird populations have trebled since they rid the island of brown and black rats. But Inchcombe Island, where I visited, where there's this population of brown rats, it's an important seabird colony or breeding colony, but not on the level of Lundy. And the rangers there, so there are rangers from Natural Environment Scotland that are kind of involved in the preservation and conservation of sort of heritage but natural species as well, and the nature of the landscapes that they're working on. And they kind of actually, I was expecting them to be very anti-rat, and actually I found them to be totally different. There was talk that the rats might be eradicated on the islands, and they were telling me that wasn't what they wanted to see. That they felt the rats were manageable. They controlled them. So every year, every couple of years, pest controllers came onto the island and laid down traps that sort of kept the population under control. But they felt that the black rat was part of the history of the island. They first arrived on Inchcombe from plague ships that were docked off before they got to mainland Scotland. And the ships were put on Inchcombe for essentially plague to sort of burn through the crew that was on board. And I mean, when they told me this, I couldn't believe it. And imagine what it must have been like being stuck on one of those plague ships. But the rats had come from there and populated the island, so they'd been there for centuries. And the seabirds there had been doing okay as well. So they've got puffins there. They had, I want to say guillemots off the top of my head. And again, it's in the book, the exact species that were there, but they were doing sort of okay. Obviously, without rats, they would probably be doing better. But the rangers were telling me there were other predators for the rats, the gulls on the island, for example. Other predators of seabird chicks, like the gulls on the island. And yeah, they were unlikely defenders of them, but I found it was interesting.
Yeah.
Down in the Channel Islands in Sark, where again, you've got black rats on an island. There's a campaign there that residents have started to keep the rats when there's been talk of wiping them out as well.
That's fascinating. I mean, whenever I think of rats on island, like you mentioned earlier, I think of the massacre of seabirds and other islands in the Pacific. Where you have flightless birds, rails,
Yeah.
for example. They were just some of them completely wiped out by the presence of rats. Now, you mentioned the bubonic plague earlier. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Was the culprit the black rat? Or I actually read somewhere recently that the brown rat could have been the one all along.
It's it's disputed to this day, David, and there is a group of researchers who claim that it's neither, and actually gerbils were the original source for
Hang on,
the black
gerbils.
death.
Who had pet gerbils in the Middle Ages in UK? Come on.
Who had pet rats? Although there is an interesting history of pet rats, which we can maybe talk about, but certainly not in the Middle Ages. There is a study, it's quite a sort of authoritative study as well, that mapped climate around the time of the origins of the Black Plague in China. And the climate was found to be, they have these big sort of explosions of wild gerbil populations every few years. There's like a mast year for gerbils. And it was found that the year that the plague sort of originated was one of those years. So there would have been a massive increase in the gerbil population. Undoubtedly, it was transported over on rat fleas as well. Rats were kind of carriers for the plague. But other studies, and again, very authoritative ones, have shown that the speed at which the plague spread in the Black Death, the massive numbers of people that were killed in such a short amount of time, meant that there was no way that it could have been rat fleas that would have been responsible for all that. And actually far more likely was human to human transmission. And that really kind of lit the fire that was the Black Death. Near to where I live in the Peak District, there's a village called Eyam, which is a very famous plague village because it was the plague turned up there during the Black Death, and it was the whole village was quarantined, and it was, I said the Black Death, sorry, no, it's in the Eyam plague was in the 17th century, so it would have been the second plague pandemic. But the village was quarantined for 18 months, and the villagers weren't allowed to leave, and food was kind of taken to the boundaries and dropped off for them, and huge amounts of the local population died. But again, there have been studies looking at the deaths in Eyam, and again, ones that have kind of exonerated rats and said that it was far more human to human transmission that did it rather than just rats scampering between households.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you actually, because the rat situation, people often say you're never far away from a rat, less than 10 foot or something. Is that true?
No, it's not. But also, we don't know. The thing that really surprised me writing this book is how little we know about rats in their natural environment, and how so many of the figures that you see and the urban myths that you read and hear are total rubbish. And a lot of it, when you dig down into these figures, I mean, I'm a journalist in my day job, and I'm used to kind of, digging down into the root of figures and standing up facts and stuff. And so much of them come from the pest control industry. And they're people with obviously skin in the game for being paid to exterminate rats. And there's just such a massive, so take the UK, for example, the discrepancy in terms of population goes from, some people say sort of 10 million, others say 270 million. And that is the kind of somewhere in the middle of that. And it's because, I mean, it's incredible, for an animal that lives so close to us and which we've had such an enduring relationship with, it's incredible how little we know about them.
Okay, that's tell me then. The other question I wanted to ask you, which is one of the ones that has been burning on my chest for many, many years, why are we so afraid of them? What is it about the rat that makes people gives people there's so much negative connotation, you dirty rat and all that sort of stuff.
That's it. Yeah,
I
there's so
remember
much
reading,
language.
I remember reading my Spider-Man comics as a kid, and he used to say rats instead of swearing, and I started doing that when I was at school as well, saying rats. There seems to be two kind of schools. There's the main school which absolutely hates them, and then there's other people like yourself and a few other people we know who have them as pets. And they think they're just as intelligent as dogs and stuff. So what is it about the rat that makes us so angry and horrified by them?
So this takes me back to answering this question, takes me back a bit to the Raven book that I wrote, and looking into kind of old folklore around animals. And similar to the Raven, back in the kind of 16th, 17th centuries, rats were associated with witchcraft, but also kind of as witches' familiars. So in the start of Macbeth, for example, when the three witches are cooking up their spells, and they say like a rat, I'll pursue. They're talking about a sort of a sailor overseas, like a rat without a tail. I'll do. There's old creatures in folklore, in Scottish folklore, something like the Llewellyn it's called, and it was a sort of rat-like creature with acidic breath that could kind of breathe death over people. So there's this kind of old sort of folkloric tradition of rats being sort of negative thing. And then I think a lot of it is to do with them threatening human food supplies as well. And actually, it's a cultural sense of them being vermin, which has been drilled into us going all the way back to the Tudor vermin acts that were kind of instigated by Henry VIII, where people, if they went and killed a rat and took the tail to the local church, you'd get a penny for it, or whatever it was back then. That then has kind of made its way into our language. So exactly like you say, rat is a noun, but it's also a verb. You rat someone out.
Yeah.
And there are very few animals that can lay claim to that. And it's really, I talked a bit about rodenticides earlier, and it's really something that accelerated this in the 20th century. So in the kind of after the Second World War in particular, when kind of Europe was starving, and this food production was maximized above everything else. And we've seen that, the impact of that on farmland birds and natural landscapes around the world, and the kind of mass advent of industrial farming. And rat eradication was a real part of that. And there was rat propaganda posters put up in the UK, kind of telling everyone it was their duty. There was even pre-Second World War in the 1920s, there was the Vermin Eradication Society pressured the government to introduce a law in the UK where made it the right of every, or the responsibility of every citizen to basically kill every rat they could see. And that's still going on today. So one of the most fascinating places I visited for the book was Alberta in Canada, where after the Second World War, they implemented so it's the one, if you look at a rat distribution map of North America, there's this one province that is white and all the rest are red, indicating that rats are there. And Alberta is this last stronghold that, due to its geography, has been able to keep them out, because it's got the Rocky Mountains, which act as a sort of barrier to British Columbia to the west, and to the south is just sort of really kind of unpopulated plains that is difficult for rats to make their way through. So they've identified this one border with Saskatchewan, an eastern front, which is about 800 miles long, and that's where the rats can get in. And it was started in the 40s, and it's still going today. There are official government rat patrols that drive up and down this border with guns and blocks of warfarin or other rodenticides in the boot, and they visit local farms and inspect any sort of rat infestation that they can. And if anything is detected, they sort of swoop on it and wipe the rats out. Now, I went out with one of these patrols, and we kind of drove around local farms and bumped over the highways in their trucks. And these kind of rat officers, the ones I was with, they'd maybe seen a rat like once or twice. The farmers we were meeting, they'd never seen a rat in their life. And it was so interesting talking to these like kind of burly, very sort of macho kind of Alberta dairy farmers about rats. And they were all saying, I'm absolutely terrified by them, because it's a creature of folklore, it's a creature of myth. And there've been all these propaganda for years and years and years telling them if rats manage to get a foothold in our province, then they're going to sort of completely wipe out the harvests and cost us billions and billions and billions of dollars.
Wow. It's interesting. I went to the Isle of Man in England, and there they have this whole big thing about rats. You can't mention a name or the animal by the name rat. It's called longtails. They're called longtails.
Really? Oh,
You
I didn't
say,
know that.
if you say rat, then it's obviously bad news. Check that one out.
I will.
Rat catchers. There's always been a big history about rat catchers. When I think about rat catchers, I think of the Victorians. I also think about the modern day rat catchers and their rodenticide fans with their potent poisons. What is the situation briefly in terms of, controlling rats using chemicals?
It's changing, in a word. This year in the UK, in July, the effective second generation anticoagulants, which are incredibly powerful, I've mentioned already, they are effectively going to be banned for outdoor use throughout the UK. Um, Elsewhere in the Netherlands, I think they've already bought that in. British Columbia, I've mentioned they've already bought that in as well. So these rodenticide use is being restricted, and this war on the rat that I mentioned is being replaced by something called integrated pest management, which is the kind of official term for it. But it's basically acknowledging defeat in the war on the rat and accepting that to control rats, we need to think of other ways of doing that. You talk of the traditional rat catcher, and there's a chapter in the book about that. There's this incredible history of rat catching. You know, it's a real art. And there's a guy of the most famous of the Victorian rat catchers you mentioned, David, is a guy called Jack Black, who
Is
he
he
was
an actor?
he's also an actor, but his
He
forebear.
looks good for his age.
But he was an actor. You know, the rat catching Jack Black was also an actor as well. He understood that public fascination with rats, and he really played on that. So he had like a cart that he towed around the streets of London, and he would have sort of bags full of live rats that he'd sort of shock these audiences by plunging his hand into and emerging sort of unscathed. And he'd have rats kind of crawling around his shoulders while he was talking to people. He anointed himself. I'm not sure exactly how true this was, but official rat catcher to Queen Victoria. Now, the royal family, they did have their official rat catchers, but I haven't been able to establish exactly if Jack Black was or if he just effectively made the myth effectively has been sort of made true in history. But he was part of this real kind of old school uh, kind of group of rat catchers that would see the rat as kind of quarry and devise all kind of ways of doing it. Nowadays, as you say, it's much more kind of giant pest control businesses and their vans and men with poison who sort of indiscriminately lay that down. But for the book, I did want to, and I did manage to find some traditional rat catchers that are still doing it the old school way. There was one guy, a guy called Matthew Blackwell, who I met in London, and he's a falconer, and he's the official falconer of Camden Market, and uses Harris hawks to hunt the pigeons there. But he is also a rat catcher. He's a rat catcher's son, and he refuses to use poison, so he does it the old school way because he's kind of he feels very strongly about the way rodenticide cascades down the food chain or up the food chain. And he kind of gets called out all over the place. There's another rat catcher in Winchester accompanied as well. And they have these dogs, terriers, that are specifically bred and have been for centuries and centuries for ratting, and kind of perfectly adapted to go under through the kind of rat burrows and sort of quickly kill them. It's quite, when you see it in action, it's pretty unpleasant, but it's also a way that, you know, even a sort of defender of the urban rat, which is someone I would definitely say I am after writing this book, I do acknowledge still that there are times when you need to get rid of them when they come to the wrong places. I had rats in my house, as I said, and it's not a nice thing when they're in your house, and you need to find ways of doing that. So it's a kind of noble profession in its way, and but it's one that's really sort of looked down upon as well. And
Yeah.
Matthews, who's a very sort of like Cockney geezer, and he was telling me that one of his kind of posher clients was looking down at him on one time. And I'm probably not allowed to swear on this.
Listen, I've had
No,
several words, four-letter included over the years, so I don't think there's not much you can say now that can shock anyone.
all right, okay. Well, you can bleep it
Especially if
out
you're
later.
quoting. If you're quoting, that's a different thing as well. So yeah.
Okay. Well, he told me he had this very kind of posh client who was sort of disparaging his work. And he just said to him, if it was that easy to catch a rat, you would have fucking done it already. Which I really love.
All right, let's flip the coin now. Let's talk about rats as lovely things that people love. I was really interested in learning about rat fancy shows. What on earth is a rat fancy show?
I was really interested in finding out about them. So I had no idea they existed before writing this book. So I'm sure everyone watching will be aware of Crufts, which is this kind of very famous dog shows you have in the UK where dogs are kind of paraded around. And there is a rat version of Crufts, and it is a society called the National Fancy Rat Society, which is the kind of center of it, the equivalent of the Kennel Club, I suppose. And they have rat shows all over the country, and they are in kind of village halls and community centres. And rat breeders will bring along their rats, just like they do at Crufts, and put them in cages for judges to anonymously judge. The show that I went to is very serious, where you can't sort of identify whose rat belongs to who. You know, it's done very sort of assiduously, and the rats are judged on all kinds of things, like their sort of the richness of their coat and the softness of their fur and the way that they carry themselves and so on. And you get trophies, and you get little rat-sized whatever they're called, badges, you know, saying first, second, third place, just that you do at Crufts as well. And there's this incredible history to it. So it was in Japan where rat breeding sort of started, and all of these rats as well, these prize-winning rats, they're all exactly the same species as brown rats. They're just brown rats that have variegated fur. So the same rats that you'd see running around the sewers of any city are here kind of being awarded trophies for the magnificence of them. And it was the Japanese that started it. And then it took off in late Victorian, early Edwardian England, where a pet rat became a real kind of, particularly among sort of middle and upper class women, it became a real sort of accessory to have. So perhaps the most famous rat owner was Beatrix Potter, and she had a pet rat, Sammy Whiskers. And so I've my book, it's credited to my two pet rats, Molly and Ermintrude, who are both sadly no longer with us. And as far as I know, the only other author who's done that is Beatrix Potter, who dedicated her book to Sammy Whiskers, her pet rat. And it kind of, around the time Beatrix Potter had them, these sort of rat shows were beginning to start, and they were a sort of enthusiasts were beginning to get together to sort of show off the different rats that were being bred. And then when the war on the rat that I'd mentioned really kind of ramped up, rat shows sort of died out, and it became a sort of thing that people didn't really do because you didn't want to be seen to be celebrating rats. But since the 70s, they've really sort of started to ramp up again. So in the UK, we have that. In the US, they have a Rat Olympics, and it's this incredible event. Although they had to change the name recently because the real Human Olympics threatened them with all kinds of copyright infringement thing. But they have rats doing, because obviously they do, and I've seen this with my pet rats, they're capable of incredible feats of intelligence and endurance. And on the Rat Olympics, you can see them on YouTube. They're doing all kinds of amazing tricks. Yeah.
Wow. So what's the benefit of a rat in terms of a pet? I mean, what's the selling point? Why get a rat?
So they are, and this again is something I've been amazed to discover. They are such, and part of the book I've done, you know, read so many kind of, because even though we don't know much about wild rats, in laboratory settings, rats have been studied by humans since the middle of the 19th century. And I argue in the book that no human has kind of sacrificed more in the pursuit of human health than the rat in terms of the medical experiments that have been done on them. But there's been a lot of psychological experiments on rats as well, and they've produced incredible results. So they've shown rats have imaginations, rats have empathy, rats giggle incredibly high, inaudible to the human here, but these kind of really sort of high frequency giggles when they're tickled. Rats grieve, and I've seen this for myself with my own pet rats as well. And when you actually spend time with them, you see all of this stuff. So them being tickled, for example, in you know how you'll have a kind of, anyone who's got a puppy or anything like that, when you walk into the house and they'll sort of bark and sort of run towards you. And our rats live on a cage in the first floor of our house. And as soon as you walk up the stairs, they kind of jump up to the cage and they're kind of rattling it, desperate to get out. We let them out. They roam all around our house, and you can call them back just as you could I don't know, a cat or a dog or whatever. and they love kind of human contact. So they'll come to you for a treat or whatever, but they'll come to you above everything just to be sort of stroked, and that really kind of tactile relationship. And that's something that really surprised me. And just to quickly mention rats grieving, because the great sort of sadness of keeping pet rats is that they're short-lived things. They live for about 2 to 3 years. In the book, there's a figure that one rat year is equivalent to 3 human months. They sort of live their lives on ultra fast forward. And we've had a couple of rats die now, and just last week, one of our pet rats, Aggie, who was actually given to me for free at one of the rat shows that I went to, because they're so lovely, the rat show community as well. And we were talking to this one breeder, and she said, "Oh, you've got to take these 2 rats," and just gave us 2 pet rats. And I wonder who would ever get given a free dog at Crufts. But Aggie died last week after a short respiratory illness, and it's left her sister Rita on her own, which is something you're really not meant to do with rats. But we're worried about introducing any other rats who might catch this illness, so we're going to let it sort of burn out before we get new rats. And the way that Rita looked after Aggie when she was dying was so heartbreaking to see. So it got to a point where she could just kind of lie there. And as I say, it was quick. This was over the course of sort of 24, 48 hours, but she was lying there, unable really to kind of eat or drink anymore. And Rita, her sister, would groom her really assiduously. She lay next to her, and would just kind of groom her again and again and again. And it was so sort of sweet to see. When my previous 2 rats are in the book, Ermentrude and Molly, they were sisters as well. And when Molly died, Ermentrude, we found her body on a kind of upstairs ledge of the cage, and Ermentrude had pulled, again, she was lying next to her even after she died, and she pulled a scrap of cloth to kind of cover her body as well. And you see these things kind of in sort of real life situations, and they're all borne out by the science as well, that they are animals with such a rich inner life, and one that so much of the stories that we tell ourselves about rats just never kind of scratches the surface of.
Wow. We've obviously trained rats to do a lot of things. I mean, apart from doing tricks, you mentioned earlier about mind detecting. How does that work?
All right, there's 2 things I've seen about rats which have just amazed me. The first is a researcher in America who's trained rats to drive cars. And again, you can see this on YouTube. It's the funniest thing. And these rats drive little remote controlled cars. The second one is a project I visited in Tanzania called Apopo, which has been going for about 30 years now. And they train rats. It's a particular species of rat called the giant African pouched rat, which are, they look a lot like the brown rat, but essentially just bigger. And like the brown rat, like the black rat, they've got incredible power of smells. And they train these rats to detect landmines in the ground. And even though they're big, they're not big enough to set off a landmine as well. And they train them up and basically reward them with food when they locate landmines, and then real kind of landmine clearers come in and sort them out. And it sounds sort of, you know, a good theoretical thing, but it happens in practice, and it's been happening for years. So these rats have cleared in excess of 160,000 landmines all over the world in countries like Angola and Cambodia. And they're sort of working today as well. I just saw a question pop up of how long do the rats live for, and they live longer than brown rats. So giant African pouch rats live for about 6, 7 years. So as a result, you can get some rats that single-handedly have cleared, you know, football fields worth of landmines. When I visited the project, their ultimate hero rat, who had actually been given the PDSA medal for animal bravery, he was the first rat to ever win it. And he was a rat called Magawa, and he just died. And there was a little sort of shrine set up to him and all the work that he'd done. It's an amazing project, and they're using, so beyond landmines, they use rats to detect tuberculosis samples as well. And again, that's happening in practice in Tanzania. So clinics from all over the country send their tuberculosis samples to Apopo because the rats sniff them out so quickly, far more quickly than kind of human detectors can. And also when I visited, they were just trialing a new project, which is still in the concept stage, but has had a fair bit of publicity on it since. And they're training up the rats as search and rescue rats, so to be deployed when there's been something like an earthquake or something like that. And I watched them trying it in a room which had been set up to look exactly like an earthquake had happened, with kind of toppled furniture and sort of loud noise blaring everywhere. And these rats were given little harnesses and with a radio kind of embedded in them, a two-way radio, and they would and sensors on them, so their trainers would know where they were going. And the rats would run in. When they found a person, they would alert their trainers by pulling a thing around their neck, and it would automatically play this radio message that said, "Hello, I'm a rat, and I'm here to save you," which I love. They're not actually being used yet, the search and rescue rats, but they hope to be doing soon.
That's amazing. Listen, what's your next project? I know you got your PhD coming up. Is there anything beyond that you're working on or thinking about working
Oh, yeah, it's gonna be something about the River Irk, basically. And I'm really interested in it's just taken me in so many interesting directions, this river. It's going to be urban again. I mean, like you, David, kind of urban wildlife is something that I'm really interested in. And some of the kind of landscapes, or some of the cityscapes that the river goes through, and the nature I've found there as well, really interests me. This idea of scrub, and how it's a sort of such an overlooked an underappreciated thing, but with such benefits as well. So yeah, I guess somewhere that wouldn't be take me too far away from rats, for example. It's gonna be a maligned urban location, I think, that doesn't get the recognition that it deserves, but it's still slightly up in the air.
Okay, well, we're definitely going to have you back when that happens. Just to let everyone know that In Conservation With is on YouTube, and if you are watching this in the future, tell all your mates, please like and subscribe, and just see the wealth of stuff that's on there. Tomorrow, not that you'll know this if you're watching this in the future, because it'll be on the list anyway, but tomorrow, for those watching it live, watching us live now, we have a lady called Lyra Valencia. She is a young woman who is brilliant. She's doing loads of stuff online on Instagram, trying to engage people in urban areas with wildlife, and she's kind of normalizing the whole thing. She's so great at putting across stuff. I'm watching her the other day talking about earthworms, and it was just incredible how she just relayed that information. Even though she's got a degree in zoology, she talks in real layman's language. So you got to come and check her out and meet her. But in the meantime, I want to thank you, Joe, yet again for a really entertaining In Conservation With on rats. I mean, I've never hated them, but I'm really more interested in them now, I must admit. So thank you for being an advocate for the rats and all their friends. So thank you very much.
That's great to hear, David. My work is done. If people feeling slightly more sort of more warm towards rats, then I can be happy. I just saw one final question I wanted to answer, if that's all right.
No, you can answer that in Q&A afterwards.
Oh, okay, all right, fine. All right.
Because we need to also, if you're watching this live on, or not even live, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to know what this question that Joe's going to answer is, you need to be a member of the Urban Bird of World community. And if you do become a member of the Urban Bird of World community, then you can actually see not only that question, but all of hundreds of questions previously asked on the Q&As for the previous guests, because the Q&A bit is only a benefit for members of the Urban Bird of World community, and you can find out more about that at theurbanbirdofworld.com. All right. So until then, until I see you in the Q&A, I might see you again in another In Conservation With, and until then, keep looking up, but also look down in case there's a rat.